District of Florida. My name is Andrea Clark. I'm the Public Information Officer here for United States Attorney Larry Keefe. And today we will be discussing an indictment that was unsealed yesterday that is of statewide significance. We're joined today by U.S. Attorney Larry Keefe, the Assistant U.S. Attorney, who is the lead prosecutor for this case, Justin Keene. We also have with us Acting Special Agent in Charge, Corey Smith. He's from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General. And finally, from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, we have Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Keith Wilmer. After some brief prepared remarks by three of our panelists, we will take your questions, but we would ask that you limit the questions that you ask today to the indictment that we are announcing. Your mics will be muted during this avail, so we ask that you use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. You are also welcome to record this session if you choose to do so. And with that, I will turn over the avail to United States Attorney Larry Keefe.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank each of you, journalists from around Florida and from around the country. We believe this is a case of at least statewide interest, and we think it's important that you know as much as you can. I want to also thank our investigative partners. Andrea identified and mentioned the United States Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, as well as our own Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the FDLE. They have been fantastic partners throughout the course of this investigation, which is continuing and ongoing, and we look forward to working with them more closely as we move forward. As Andrea mentioned at the outset, we will allow and certainly encourage questions at the conclusion of the initial remarks, but I want to make certain that I let each of you know that in the federal system and under the federal rules, there are great limitations on what we can say outside the courtroom in these federal criminal prosecutions. So I understand, I share your frustration to some extent, because I think it's important that there be as much transparency in this process as possible so that we can have and obtain accountability where it is needed, but we must comply with those rules. So please be aware of that as we get to the question and answer part of this. I do want each of you to know that today at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, here in the federal courthouse in Tallahassee, in the Judge Magistrate's courtroom at 1:30, the two defendants in this case will be making their initial appearance before the judge. And so that will be an opportunity to learn more about this case as well. I would encourage you to arrive approximately 1 o'clock, half hour or so before the 1:30 start to be in position. So let me move forward. As alleged in the indictment in this case that was unsealed yesterday, the two defendant individuals fraudulently accessed the questions and answers to Florida's teacher certification examination. Through fraudulent means, they were able to access the content, including the questions and answers, and that enabled them, as alleged in the indictment, to appropriate and obtain the questions and answers. They sold those questions and answers, and this is explained in greater detail in the indictment. Those questions and answers were purchased by those who sought teacher certification in Florida. A very significant thing beyond just the simple, straightforward two individuals and a group of others with whom they were working, who are identified in the indictment, beyond the fact of the theft of these trade secrets, which are owned by the Florida Department of Education, the significant component of this that I do believe has statewide interest is that a significant number that I can't be specific about right now, but a significant number, and hopefully in compliance with court rules and requirements will be a point at which there's greater specificity to that, but a significant number of individuals as well as organizations obtained these questions and answers and were part of the dissemination of them and use of them by a certain numerical segment of people who sat for and took and prepared for the exam. Now, trade secret theft or misappropriation cases are actually quite common. They often occur between private businesses, and the trade secret disputes are often the subject of purely civil, private, if you will, civil litigation. The state prosecutors also bring cases for trade secret misappropriation and theft. when the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office gets involved in a matter, there needs to be, and it's important that there be a specific particular federal interest that's triggered to draw federal resources and interest. In this particular case, federal taxpayer dollars were appropriated to the state of Florida and used by the Florida Department of Education in this teacher certification, evaluation, and testing process. So that's a component. We are always watchful in the Department of Justice to make certain that, that federal taxpayer dollars are spent as they should and they're properly safeguarded. Second, the second component that triggered a federal interest in this case is that this is not just an internal to Florida situation, but this is an interstate situation. States other than Florida were involved in the transactions in this case. And there is also an international component to this case. Countries other than the United States were involved in the transactions that are encompassed in this case. The international aspects of this and what countries were involved will be matters that we will not go into any detail about today. Hopefully at a later date, particularly as the investigation continues, there will be appropriate ways in compliance with the federal rules that apply here about transparency as much as possible on that information. The third critical aspect of the federal interest here is we have a situation where the misappropriation of these questions and answers have had the effect potentially of corrupting the process by which Florida, the third largest state in this country, tests, evaluates, and certifies its teachers as well as its educational leaders, administrators, and principals. It is this direct secondary impact of these private individuals and their private organizations' misappropriation of the questions and answers. It is this direct secondary impact that trade secret information was a critical component in this process that the state of Florida uses to test, evaluate, and ultimately certify its teachers, principals, and administrators. So those three things combined to cause the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office in this case to engage and work with our partners with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Inspector General, as well as the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to find out what happened here and bring as much transparency as we can through the criminal prosecution process so that there is some accountability, because we want to do everything we can to maintain the great trust that the people of Florida have in the Florida Department of Education. It's very, very important to note here that despite this implication or inference that may be drawn that there is a cloud on the competency and or integrity of one or more or a significant number, as we believe the case to be, teachers and principals in the state of Florida, it's very important to understand that our teachers and our school administrators, vast majority of them are highly competent, high integrity, and selflessly do great and good work each day through very challenging times for all of us, the students, the parents, and the public at large in Florida. So great care has to be taken here to make certain that the work we're doing to provide accountability in this case doesn't cast a improper cloud or paint with too broad a brush with our good teachers and administrators. Assistant United States Attorney Justin Keene, who is the lead on this case, his wife is a teacher. My father and mother were both in education. My father was a teacher. My mother worked he was a high school teacher. My mother worked in a library. So I've grown up in the culture with deep and abiding respect for our teachers and school administrators. Another thing that's important to point out in this case is that the Florida Department of Education has been an excellent partner throughout this process. The Florida Department of Education reported the anomalies that triggered their concern in this to the authorities. They've worked very, very closely with the Office of Inspector General of the United States Department of Education and FDLE. The Florida Department of Education has been an excellent partner that's fully cooperated in all this and been key in its assistance and support of us throughout this investigation. And the Florida Department of Education continues to be a partner in this case and in this prosecution. But an obvious upshot of this is that the Florida Department of Education has a challenge going forward in terms of addressing and dealing with the significant number of people who may now be certified as teachers and principals and administrators to determine what the appropriate things that need to be done as the state's curators and custodians of this Florida educational system and process. Coming in for a landing, at least on my initial remarks, I view this case as part of the work of our office's public trust unit. You all have seen over the last year or so that the public trust unit has been in place here. Our work with elected officials in public corruption cases, government employees and officials who hold trusted positions who have become corrupt. You have seen our work in the area of election security, and you've seen our work in instances involving healthcare and Medicaid fraud where trusted physicians commit fraudulent acts. We view this seemingly private act by two private individuals in terms of the trade secret misappropriation as triggering our interest in the public trust unit because in this instance, the stolen trade secret information directly impacts the integrity of the education system in the state of Florida. So with that, I will at this time introduce once again Assistant United States Attorney Justin Keene. He is the lead prosecutor on this case, and Justin Keene will tell you more specifically about the facts alleged in the indictment, the particulars of the federal criminal statutes that we allege in the indictment were violated, and speak to such issues as potential penalties and incarceration. So Assistant United States Attorney Keene.
Thank you and good morning, and thank you for your interest in this case. The indictment that has been unsealed yesterday, it is lengthy. It is about 65 pages, and my hope this morning is to be able to give you a little bit of a summary of what's alleged in there and put it in more layman's terms. The indictment alleges 114 counts of various federal crimes, the first of which is conspiracy to commit racketeering, or what's also known as a RICO conspiracy. It's a federal crime for anyone associated with an enterprise, or in this case, the business, NABA Ed, whose activities involve or affect interstate or foreign commerce, to participating in that business activities through a pattern of what's called racketeering activity. The indictment in this case alleges that the Jaspers, the owners of NABA Ed in the Fort Myers area, conspired to commit a pattern of racketeering activity through that business. And the racketeering activity alleged in this indictment is wire fraud. And essentially the fraudulent scheme that was devised and conspired to be committed by the Jaspers and others, including NABA Ed's employees and contractors, it's alleged in the indictment that the scheme was to represent to the Florida Department of Education during the test registration process to become a teacher that they were not going to take any of the testing materials out of the testing center, including by memory, or share the content of the test materials with anybody before, during, or after such an exam. And when they were registering, it's alleged that they had to click a checkbox online that indicates that they agree to various test rules or non-disclosure agreements. It's further alleged that when they actually get to the test center, the test examinees have to read a non-disclosure agreement splash screen that indicates they agreed to non-disclosure terms and conditions, as well as the rules that they already agreed to. And when they click OK, that is when the exam is then loaded onto the computer at the test center. And by saying falsely that they will follow those terms and conditions and not share the information with anybody, that is the fraudulent misrepresentation. That's the lie that we've alleged in the indictment. And it's alleged in the indictment that the use of the wire communications in part involved the payment and registration data that went from the examinee's computer where they registered to Pearson VUE, who's been a partner for the Department of Education here in Florida, to administer the test and also to provide test security. So that registration and payment data goes from the registrant's computer interstate to Pearson VUE, which has servers in several other states. And then that information is then wire transmitted to the state of Florida Department of Education as part of the registration process. It's also alleged in the indictment that as part of the registration process, once an examinee sits for the exam, takes the test, and then completes the test, that unofficial score report is then transmitted from the test testing computer wherever it's taken in the world to Pearson VUE, and then ultimately the unofficial score results are then electronically transmitted in some fashion to the state of Florida Department of Education to be reviewed, validated, and then an official score report gets generated. So the wire fraud is alleged to include those acts, and that is what's alleged to be the pattern of racketeering activity that's alleged in the indictment. We also alleged, and it's conspiracy to commit wire fraud is charged in addition to the conspiracy to racketeer. There are 108 counts of wire fraud laid out in the indictment. And then the last category of crimes that we've charged in this indictment are conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets, and there are 3 counts of theft of trade secrets. And what I'd like to do is briefly touch on that. The reason that there are 3 separate theft of trade secret counts alleged in the indictment that you'll see is because each one of them is a different way that we've alleged that theft of trade secrets was committed. The first count of theft of trade secrets involves the taking or the obtaining by fraud of the proprietary test material from the Florida Department of Education. The second alleged method of theft of trade secrets that's charged in the indictment involves the duplication or the further dissemination of those proprietary test questions and answers. And the third theft of trade secrets charge alleges that the Jaspers had possessed or received the stolen test material knowing that it was obtained by fraud or improper means. So when you look through the indictment, I hope that gives you a little bit of a framework to understand and process that 65-page document. In terms of potential penalties, the racketeering conspiracy, the wire fraud conspiracy, and the wire fraud counts all carry a statutory maximum of 20 years in federal prison, and the conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets and the theft of trade secrets counts, they all carry a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. One thing I just wanted to note, if people see a case like this, they may have some question about why are the feds involved, and I know Mr. Keefe covered that. This case embodies 3 interests in the federal government, and I know Mr. Keefe touched on that, but those 3 interests involve or include the federal funds being used to certify Florida educators in the classrooms, interstate and foreign commerce, and, as Mr. Keefe noted, the public's trust. I'd like to now pass the microphone, so to speak, over to Acting SAC Smith from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Inspector General.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I am Corey Smith, Acting Special Agent in charge of the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, Southeastern Regional Office. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Office of Inspector General is the law enforcement arm of the Department of Education. As part of our responsibilities, we conduct investigations of fraud, abuse, and other criminal activity involving department funds and programs. What we are here to talk about today is an example of our commitment to investigating allegations of significant fraud and abuse involving federal education funds. As stated by U.S. Attorney Keefe and the other panelists, the Jaspers knowingly and willfully preyed on innocent school districts, promising to help their teachers prepare for certification and leadership exams. I want to commend the OIG special agents and our federal law enforcement colleagues whose efforts brought about today's actions. I am especially grateful for our stakeholders, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, as well as the Florida Department of Education. I want to also thank you again, U.S. Attorney Keefe, for calling this press conference today and shining the spotlight on these allegations regarding fraud. The OIG will continue to aggressively pursue those who misappropriate education funds for their own purposes. America's students and taxpayers deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thanks very much for all of your comments. We really appreciate having that background before we get started with our Q&A. So as we began this webinar, we attempted to send you the press release and the indictment to everyone who registered to participate today. I've been receiving some kickbacks because the indictment file size is large. So if you haven't already gotten both of those documents, you'll see them come in shortly under 2 separate emails. The indictment also was unsealed yesterday afternoon, so it is available on PACER for those of you who have access to the PACER website. So at this time, we will now take your questions as they relate to the indictment of Kathleen and Jeremy Jasper using that Q&A feature on your screen. Thank you. To start us off, we have a question for Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Could you please explain what your role was in this investigation?
Yes, good morning. Again, I'm Keith Wilmer. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge for the Tallahassee Regional Operations Center for FDLE. And to echo, I believe in the press release of the Special Agent in charge, Mark Perez, this is a good example of the federal and state agencies working together. We were contacted by Department of Education, and ultimately what we were able to do early on was to actually go to one of the testing facilities and obtain a study guide, and that was ultimately found to obtain proprietary test material. We also included or participated in various analytical and investigative activities throughout the investigation to include the service of search warrants. But this was a great job by DOE, and we were glad to be part of it.
Thank you very much for that. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. Assistant U.S. Attorney Keene, can you speak to Pearson VUE's role in this matter and in this investigation, please?
Yes, so as alleged in the indictment, the Florida Department of Education is contracted with Pearson VUE to provide test security and test administration services. They have been helping the Florida Department of Education along with us during the investigation in providing technical assistance and investigative resources.
Thank you. So another question for Assistant U.S. Attorney Keene from Jada Williams. How far-reaching are the districts that are involved in this matter? Do we know if teachers in Leon County were a part of this?
So the indictment alleges that the business, Now to Ed, provided in-person and online tutoring and test preparation services throughout Florida. The indictment doesn't specifically name which counties were involved. However, as the case progresses, that information may become more publicly known.
All right, thank you. All right, we have from Pamela McCabe. Is it known how much money the Jaspers, through their company Inava Ed, may have taken during their alleged actions? I believe Assistant U.S. Attorney Keene, you can answer this as well.
I would hesitate to give an exact dollar figure. The numbers have climbed throughout the investigation and are likely to increase as the case progresses. But what I would probably focus on is not the amount of money involved, but the frequency and duration of the offense. And as the indictment lays out, over a 4-year period, there are 108 counts of wire fraud that correspond to various testing dates and locations.
Great. So from Rick Flagg, we have the question, when did the alleged activity begin? And this is also a question for AUSA Justin Keene.
Thank you. The indictment alleges that the criminal activity began on or about March 24th of 2016 and continued until on or about March 10th of this year.
All right. From Ryan Daly, is there any course of action defined yet from the state or from the U.S. Department of Education on penalties for teachers who took the exam fraudulently? And will they lose certification? We'll go ahead and let U.S. Attorney Keefe answer that question.
Thank you, Andrea. And before I address that, a lot of the, as I sort of indicated at the outset of this, we're very constrained at this particular phase, really only being able to talk about what has been alleged in the indictment that has now been unsealed and open to the public. And so that's the reason for the constraint on the answers and the attribution back to the indictment itself. For similar reasons, things that are outside the indictment, such as what sorts of policy decisions that policymakers such as the United States Department of Education and the Florida Department of Education are going to make on how they deal with the information that flows out of this investigation and prosecution. That's really beyond the mission of the Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's Office as to what the Florida Department of Education and the United States Department of Education choose to do in terms of remedial or curative effects and to protect against potential vulnerabilities in this critical process.
Thank you. So another question for Assistant U.S. Attorney Keene from Michael Moline. How significant a player in the market are the accused? Do we have any information about how many companies provide the same service as NavaEd?
That's not something that we specifically investigated or looked into, but I'm sure that that information was probably publicly available on a Google search or something like that.
Okay. So we already spoke to when the investigation began, but this is a two-part question from Mike Vasilinda. If the activity ended this past March, was that when the investigation began? AUSA Keene, did you want to take that and possibly clarify when the activity ended?
I'm unmuted now. My apologies. If I understand the question, is for how long the criminal activity has gone on? Is that the question?
Well, the question actually is, if the activity ended this past March, was that when the investigation began? So can we provide some clarification on the dates?
The activity alleges that the indictment alleges the activity began in 2016. The indictment also alleges that at one point in time, the Florida Department of Education noted some anomalies, and I believe that the date in the indictment is 2018. The indictment also notes in the forfeiture section a search warrant having been conducted in March of 2020. And so those dates are in the indictment, and I think that may give you a better timeline at this time.
Okay, thank you. All right, and from Jessica Foster, do we know which school districts in the state were involved? AUSA Keene?
The indictment alleges statewide, so that potentially would cover all the school districts, but at this point, this morning, we can't really answer that, but I would encourage your attendance at the 1:30 IA in case there's any additional information presented in court.
Okay, and we may have the same answer to this question, but we have time for one more, so I'll go ahead and ask again to AUSA Keene. Do we have an estimate of the number of teachers and administrators who were clients of NavaEd during the 4 years?
as Mr. Keith pointed out at the beginning of his comments, a significant number, but at this point, that's not something that's alleged in the indictment that we would be able to provide you.
All right, great. All right, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions today. So I would remind you that there will be an initial appearance that as we've mentioned throughout the our webinar today. And at this time, I would like to turn the floor back over to U.S. Attorney Larry Keefe to close us out.
Yes, once again, we thank each of you journalists that have joined us today to demonstrate and show your interest in this case. One more time, I will say I think I can identify to some extent with your frustration the desire for information, to know more, to find out what's going on here. I hope that we've said enough, given our constraints about only being limited to what is in the indictment at this particular point, to let you know that it is our belief this is a matter of statewide, perhaps even national concern, and that our challenge going forward is to make certain that we as federal prosecutors comply with all the rules that have to do with how we are curators and custodians of the information that we obtain through the investigative process. We cannot simply obtain information through the criminal investigative process, through the grand jury, through our subpoena powers and the other tools that we have, and make them simply publicly available instantly. And so the challenge here for us and our investigative partners with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the U.S. Department of Education Officer Inspector General is to do our jobs within the rules that we have to prosecute this case, to preserve the right to fair trial for these two particular defendants, while at the same time, in a lawful, appropriate way, share what we can with the Department of Education, the Florida Department of Education, so they can be good public servants and carry out their mission effectively to assess and determine what had happened in this instance, to guard and protect potential vulnerabilities going forward, and to work with us on a going forward basis to try to detect, disrupt, and dismantle any further attempts, whether it's the Florida Department of Education or any other federal, state, or local institution, where whether it's foreign actors with malign intent or simply individuals who out of a profit or greed motive would do things that impact the critical mission of our government institutions, and most importantly, have the potential to, if not actually, erode the public's trust in their own government. So we will do what we can when we can in compliance with the rules to share information beyond the scope of our work as prosecutors. And we hope that you continue to do your good work as journalists to bring transparency and accountability to all who are involved here, whether it be our office, whether it be the government institutions who are involved, or those who are considering or thinking about, whether in this setting and others, to do things that prejudice the mission of our government institutions and impact the public's trust in them. That's all I have. Thank you all very much. And hopefully we'll see some of you in federal court here in Tallahassee at 1:30 Eastern this afternoon.